Hello again, everybody. This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. Today we're starting a new short story by Guy de Maupassant called Boule de Suif, or Suet Dumpling. This is part one of four, and it's translated by Roger Collette, Jimmy's favorite translator of Guy de Maupassant. Hope you enjoy it. Boule de Suif. For several days in succession, remnants of a routed army had been passing through the town. They were not disciplined units, but bands of stragglers. The men's beards were unkempt and dirty, their uniforms in rags, and they slouched along without colors or regiments, and all of them seemed crushed and exhausted and incapable of thought or resolution, marching only out of force of habit and dropping with fatigue as soon as they stopped. Most of them were reservists, men of peace who had been quietly living on private means and who were staggering under the weight of their rifles, or lively little militiamen as prone to panic as they were to enthusiasm and as ready to attack as they were to flee. And among them were a few regulars in red breeches, the remains of some division ground to powder in a big battle, somberly clad gunners intermingled with all of these different infantrymen, and here and there the shining helmet of a dragoon, whose heavy tread was making it difficult for him to keep up with the brisker pace of the soldiers of the line. We're going to analyze this as we go, and then we'll do an overall interpretation of this short story. But I want you to remember what's important. So far, we're seeing here is a third-person narration. Third-person narration is outside the story talking to us. And if you remember, and you've been reading with Jimmy for any length of time, or if this is your first story, the first page, the first paragraph, the first section of anything we read, anything, story, novel, drama, is always the most important because it sets the tone for the rest of the story. So it's especially important to understand it, appreciate it, and to take our time. So let's go back and just look at this for a moment and read the first sentence, which is very short. For several days in succession, remnants of a routed army, routed, adjective modifying army, routed, beat, destroyed, routed, had been passing through the town. We don't know the name of the town yet, but this looks like a retreat of some sort. And they weren't disciplined units, but stragglers. So imagine Maupassant is one of the greatest classical writers because he paints with his words, right? The narrator, the third-person narrator. Remember, the third-person narrator is omniscient. It is not de Maupassant. It's just a third-person narrator. But because Maupassant's the writer, we understand that now he's painting with words. He's one of the best painters with words that you'll ever read. I believe he studied it under Flaubert. Not that that's important. The men's beards were unkempt and dirty, their uniforms in rags, and they slouched along without colors or regiments, slouched along. All of them seemed crushed and exhausted. What great language. I'm tired, Ma. Sometimes when you go home, you say, I'm tired, right? I'm exhausted. What a better word, huh? Next time you go home and you're tired after work, if you work, no, I'm kidding. I'm exhausted. Or if, you had a fight at work and you lost a big payroll or job or whatever, I'm crushed. My boss is crushing me. Incapable of thought or resolution. Incapable, they don't think. They're just going through the motions. Have you ever felt like that? Crushed and exhausted, incapable of thought? I have. Marching along out of force of habit and dropping with fatigue as soon as they stop. Imagine that. You're marching, and if you stop, you just drop from fatigue. Oh man. Anyway, they're going through here, and it's a beautifully painted picture of a retreat. Let's continue, shall we? Detachments of francs-tireurs with the high-sounding names like the Avengers of Defeat, Citizens of the Grave, Companions of Death, pass through in their turn looking like bandits. So these are detachments of probably militia with high-sounding names, right? Snipers, that's the translation for that French. Their leaders were former drapers and corn merchants, or sometimes dealers in soap and tallow. And they were only temporary warriors who had been elected officials by virtue of their money or the length of their mustaches. That's the third person narrator being a little, how would you say, facetious? they were elected officers in this retreating army by virtue of their money. In other words, they had enough money to pay people off, right? Or the length of their mustaches. Armed to the teeth and covered with flannel and gold braid, they talked in loud voices, discussing plans of campaign and boastfully declaring that they alone were carrying their dying country on their shoulders. But they sometimes went in fear of their own men. Thoroughgoing scoundrels who are often incredibly brave, but given to looting and debauchery. Look up the word debauchery, and you'll understand what that means. So often these people who paid money to become officers, right? If we go back for a moment, they were covered with flannel and gold braid, and they talked in loud voices, planning the campaign. We're carrying the dying country on our shoulders. But sometimes they went in fear of their own men, who were thoroughgoing scoundrels, often very brave, but given to looting and debauchery. War is hell. So what we're looking at, you're going to find out, is Prussian versus the French, and we're in the town of Rouen. You're going to find that out shortly. People were saying that the Prussians, oh, look at that, we're finding it out in the next sentence. The Prussians would soon be in Rouen. So the town we're looking at, is Rouen, R-O-U-E-N, French town. And people, French, were saying that the Prussians would soon be here. Okay, so this is a retreating French army. Got it? The National Guard, who for the last 2 months had been cautiously reconnoitering the neighboring woods, occasionally shooting their own sentries, and preparing for action every time a rabbit stirred in the undergrowth, had gone home. So the Army of France, the National Guard, who had been preparing and reconnoitering, checking out, isn't that a great word? Reconnoitering. I used to teach this to sophomores when I was a teacher, when Jimmy was a teacher, and we would study the language because these were underachievers, and reconnoitering was a great word. I still like that word. Have you ever reconnoitered? Check that. It means to check out. I would tell the sophomores in high school, why don't you go on the corner and reconnoiter the ladies? Kidding. So the National Guard is gone. Their arms, their uniforms, all the apparatus of war, which had previously made them the terror of the high roads for miles around, had suddenly disappeared. The last French soldiers had finally just crossed the Seine, making for Pont-au-Mur by way of the Saint-Sever and Boule. Pardon my French pronunciations. In their rear, walking between the two staff officers, came the general, in despair, unable to attempt anything with this disorganized rabble. He was bewildered himself by the disaster which had overwhelmed the people accustomed to victory, and now, despite its legendary courage, was utterly defeated. Then so you see, there's something bad that happened to the French. They were just totally wiped out. They were defeated. And they're used to victory. So when you lose, it's not a good thing. And then a profound calm, an atmosphere of silent, terrified foreboding had descended upon the town. Foreboding, something bad is going to happen. A great many pot-bellied citizens, don't forget who's narrating this, the third-person narrator, emasculated by years of trade and commerce, waited anxiously for the arrival of the conquerors, terrified lest their roasting spits or their long kitchen knives might be regarded as weapons. So the townspeople, pot-bellied citizens, right, who years are emasculated. In other words, they're not really warriors. They're afraid now because the conquerors are coming in. Who are the conquerors? The Prussians. So imagine yourself in a town, you're French, you've just been defeated, and here come the conquerors. Life seemed to have come to a standstill, and the shops were closed and the streets deserted. Now and then, some inhabitants, awed by the silence, would hurry along, keeping close to the walls. Beautifully written to express what? This whole idea of foreboding, silence, terror. So they walk, silence, right? And they hurry along, keeping close to the walls. The strain of waiting made everybody long for the enemy to arrive. I wrote down here, calm before the storm. Listen to this sentence. This is, of course, translated, but listen to the sentence. The strain of waiting made everybody long for the enemy to arrive. Have you ever felt the strain of waiting in a waiting room, for example, or you're waiting in line for something, and you just long for something to happen? On the afternoon of the day following the departure of the French troops, a few uhlans appearing from heaven knows where galloped through the town. This is a cavalryman with a lance. And then a little later, a dark mass of troops swept down St. Catherine's Hill, while two other invading torrents streamed in along the roads from Dartnell and Bougelmais. The advance guards of three bodies arriving at exactly the same moment linked up at the Palace du Hôtel de Ville, and the German army came pouring down all the nearby streets, the cobblestones ringing under the heavy, measured tread of its battalions. Here they come. Orders were shouted in a strange, guttural tongue, resounded along the walls of the houses which seemed dead and deserted, while behind the closed shutters, eyes watched the conquerors. Eyes watched the conquerors, right? Who by right of war were now the masters of the city and of the lives and fortunes of the people. In their darkened rooms, the inhabitants had given way to the same feeling of panic which is aroused by natural cataclysms, those devastating upheavals of the earth against which wisdom and strength alike are of no avail. So they're just feeling like this is unbelievable. Panic. It's panic. Why? It's like panic when you're in a tornado or when you're in a hurricane. It's panic. For the same feeling is experienced whenever the established order of things is upset and when security ceases to exist. Don't forget who's saying this. It's the third-person narrator telling us this. And when all that was previously protected by the laws of man or nature is suddenly placed at the mercy of brutal, unreasoning force. Talk about fear and panic, huh, ladies and gentlemen? The earthquake burying a whole people beneath the ruins of their houses, the river and spate sweeping away the bodies of drowned peasants together with the carcasses of cattle and rafters torn from the roofs, or the victorious army slaughtering all who resist, making prisoners of the rest, and looting by right of the sword, and thanking their God to the sound of cannon, All of these are terrifying scourges which undermine all of our belief in eternal justice and all the trust that we have been taught to place in divine protection and human reason. This is beautifully written. And if you really want to read something that happens, read about the sack of Rome in I think it was 1526. So when armies defeat other armies and come in, it's the civilians that pay the price. It's still the third person narration, but this is a personal third person narrator. Notice the use of the word our, which undermines all of our belief. He's putting us together with these people. The third person narrator is bringing us into the story. He's not in the story. He's third person. He's outside, but he's talking to us like it's our, right? It's not normally considered a pronoun, but it doesn't stand alone in place of a noun, right? It's normally not considered a pronoun. Our belief. It's an adjective modifying belief. Oh, whose belief? Our belief. And the third person is narrating. Small detachments of men were soon knocking at the door of every house and disappearing inside. Occupation was following invasion. The time had come for the vanquished to be obliging to the victors. You see what's happening here? Now, it's the invading army is taking over and they're moving right in. Can you imagine? Imagine that for a moment, that you're invaded, we're invaded, and suddenly the invading army is knocking on the door, come on in, right? Knock on the door, boom, boom, right? After a little while, once the first panic had subsided, a new sort of calm descended on the town. In many homes, a Prussian officer took his meals with the family. And sometimes he was a man of breeding, and out of politeness, he expressed sympathy with France, saying how much he disliked taking part in this war. His hosts were grateful to him for that sentiment. And besides, someday they might need his protection. And if they humored him, they might perhaps have fewer men billeted on them. So it's not just one soldier sometimes. Maybe it's 4, maybe it's 8. And so why hurt somebody's feelings when you were entirely in his power? To do so would be to display foolhardiness rather than courage. And foolhardiness is no longer one of the failings of the bourgeois of Rouen, as it was in the days when the heroic defense of their city had brought them honor and glory. So they're not foolhard. Are they foolhardy if they resist? Finally, looking for their supreme justification in the French tradition of courtesy, they argued that it was perfectly permissible to treat the foreign soldiers politely inside their own homes, provided that there was no fraternization in public. So what you did in private, that was okay. You see, what's this called, ladies and gentlemen, when you do that? What are these? What's the narrator telling us that the people of Rouen have been doing? That's right, rationalizing. Well, we could be friendly with them inside, but not outside the house. We don't want anybody to know we're fraternizing with the enemy. Outside, they refused to recognize them, but indoors, they were quite prepared to chat with them, and the Germans stayed longer with them every evening, warming themselves at the domestic hearth. So they're just, Germans are in, right? They're being treated. The town itself gradually began to assume normal appearance. Look at that. True, the French did not go out much as yet, but the streets swarmed with Prussian soldiers. Why should they, right? What is more, the officers of the Blue Hussars, arrogantly trailing their great instruments of death along the pavement, did not seem to show much more contempt for ordinary civilians than they had for the French light infantry officers, who the year before had sat drinking in the same cafes. So these Germans, they were just as arrogant as the French people who were in those cafes. You see what I'm saying here? So here's a note, during the Franco-Prussian War, that's when this is, Rouen was occupied by the Prussians. During the First World War, the British used Rouen as a supply base, and there were many military hospitals. During World War II, the town was occupied by Germany. So this is a town that's been under the gun, right? That's just a little side note. That's outside the story, but I figured a little background would help you. What you should be paying attention to is what the third person narrator is telling you, that these people in Rouen are not. They're noticing that these officers are not they're not any different than the French officers. They were just as arrogant. There was, however, something in the air, something subtle, mysterious, an unbearable alien atmosphere which hung about like a smell, the smell of invasion. What does invasion smell like? Ladies and gentlemen, we have five senses, right? You know what the five senses are? I'm writing down five senses, right? Sight, right? Sound, smell, taste, touch, right? So what does invasion smell like? That's interesting, isn't it? The third person narrator is painting with words. Invasion doesn't have a specific smell, but he's inviting you, ladies and gentlemen, to use your imagination and imagine what it smells like. It filled the town's houses and public places. It changed the taste of the foodstuffs. And it made people feel as if they were in a foreign land. You understand that? Far from home, among dangerous, savage tribes. So in other words, you're not comfortable. You're never comfortable. Are you comfortable in your home? Some homes are more so than others. But when you come home after a long day, you feel, oh my God, I'm so glad to be here, right? That's not the case here. They're never comfortable. Because why? Because there's foreign soldiers being billeted in their homes. The conquerors demanded money. Of course they did. A great deal of money. And the inhabitants went on paying up. And after all, they were rich enough. But the wealthier a Norman businessman becomes, the more keenly he feels any sacrifice, and the more he suffers at seeing any portion of his fortune pass into other hands. What does that sound like? The richer they are, the greedier they are, the more cheap they are, right? The more they can't stand it. Now, who's saying this? Who's saying this? This sentence right here. Who says that? The third person narrator. So we have to believe him. Now, if you don't, well, Jim, I grew up in France. Jimmy, I grew up in France. I'm not like that, and I'm very wealthy. Well, that's okay. Forget about your wealth. Forget about the fact that you grew up in France and read the story. And don't forget, this is a while ago. And this is the narrator talking to us for a specific reason. In the meantime, 5 or 6 miles downstream from the city, in the vicinity of Crozet, Dipelay, or Besset, barges of fishermen often used to bring up from the riverbed the bloated corpses of Germans in uniform who had been stabbed or kicked to death, or had their heads smashed in with a stone, or had been pushed over the parapet of a bridge. Aha! So down the road a little bit, right? Down the road from Rouen, there's some what does that mean? These Germans are not dying by themselves. Somebody's killing them. The resistance, right? The river mud swallowed up the victims of these secret acts of vengeance. Savage, but legitimate. Savage, but legitimate. Third person narrator saying these are legitimate. Why are they legitimate? To stab, kick to death, or have your head bashed in with a stone? Because you're at war. More dangerous than battles fought in broad daylight. These unknown deeds of heroism, these silent attacks, were more dangerous than battles fought in broad daylight and without the reward of fame. So he's talking about the resistance, right? There's some people who are resisting these German invaders. And they're defending the homeland. That's what you do when you're invaded. Hatred of the foreigner always inspires a few brave men who are ready to die for an ideal. I'm going to repeat that. Hatred of the foreigner always inspires a few brave men who are ready to die for an ideal. Now, that's the third person narrator making that observation. You have to believe it if you're going to understand this story, and you should understand it if you're going to understand the story, and I want you to understand it. However, is that a universal truth? Let's back off for a moment and think about this. Jimmy told you that third person narrators, you have to believe them, otherwise the story doesn't make sense. And that's true. But we should learn at the same time through third and first person narrators how other people lead their lives and how we should lead our own. So are you paying them money? Are you doing what the people of Rouen do? Bring them in, talk to them. If you talk to them in your home but not in public, are you a hypocrite? Are you? What's going on here? Or are you like the people down here in the vicinity of these three towns where you're actually killing some of these people? It's an interesting contrast, and I want you to keep that in mind for the rest of the story, because this story takes place after these Prussians take over Rouen and the surrounding countryside. At length, as the invaders were subjecting the town to their inflexible discipline. Got it? Inflexible discipline, had perpetrated none of the atrocities which rumor had attributed them throughout the course of their triumphal progress. So they didn't really commit any atrocities. So the inhabitants plucked up courage, and the urge to do business stirred again in the hearts of the local tradesmen. All right, let's do some business. So some of them had considered business interests at Le Havre, which was still in the hands of the French army. You see, when you invade, you take pieces of the countryside. And this is way before World War I, ladies and gentlemen. So this is a different type of warfare. So they're saying that there's Le Havre, which is still under the hands of the French army. Some of the people in Rouen were considering, well, we've got some business over there. And they were anxious to reach that port by traveling overland to Dieppe and there taking a ship. Got it? Using the influence of German officers whose acquaintance they had made, remember, these are the people who have been, cavorting with the enemy. They succeeded in obtaining a permit to leave Rouen from the general in command. You see what they're doing? They're using the soldiers to get the permit so they could leave. A large 4-horse coach was accordingly hired for this journey, and 10 persons reserved seats in it. And it was decided to set off one Tuesday morning before daybreak to avoid any risk of drawing a crowd. They want to leave before they attract attention. You understand? That whole part of the beginning of the story was to set the stage for what these 10 travelers are going to do for the rest of the story. This is called a long wind-up. Why did the third person narrator use these pages to create this atmosphere? Because he wants to put the story in context. So what you're going to be witnessing now, is a story about these 10 people who are trying to get out of town, get out of Dodge. They got a permit. They cajoled the officer to give them the permit. They reserved seats. And they're going to leave one Tuesday morning before daybreak so they don't attract attention. Why? Well, they don't want people to know they're leaving. For some days now, the ground had been frozen hard. And on the Monday, about 3:00 in the afternoon, great dark clouds from the north brought snow, which fell continuously all that evening and throughout the night. Oh no, snow! At 4:30 in the morning, the travelers met in the courtyard of the Hotel de Normandie, where they were to board the coach. They were still half asleep and shivering with cold under their wraps. Remember, this is the 1871, whatever. It's very different than today. They could scarcely see each other in the darkness. And with all the heavy winter clothing they had put on, they looked like portly priests in long cassocks. Portly priests in long cassocks. Two of the men recognized each other, and a third joined them, and they got into a conversation. So the two of the men recognized each other. "I'm taking my wife away," said one. "So am I." "Me too," said the third. And the first one added, "We're not coming back to Rouen. And if the Prussians advance on Le Havre, we're going to cross over to England." So these are three guys talking about, so they have their three wives, three men, that's six. There's four other people on this coach. Keep track if you're a mathematician. All three had the same intentions, being of the same ilk. What's ilk? Do you know, ladies and gentlemen? Look it up. Same kind, ilk. Same kind of people. Meanwhile, there was no sign of the horses. A small lantern carried by the ostler. What's an ostler? It's a man employed to look after horses of people staying at an inn. He emerged now and then from one dark doorway, only to disappear straight away into another. So this guy's moving in and out of doorways with a lantern. Remember, it's pitch black. There's no lanterns. It's snowing, right? There's nothing going on here. I want to fix this word here. It's bothering me. At an inn. Thank you. Whoops. Thank you. He's going in and out of doorways. The sound of horses' hoofs stamping on the ground could be heard. Aha! Muffled by the manure in the litters, and the voice of the man talking to the animals and swearing came from the far end of the building. A faint tinkle of bells proclaimed that the horses were being put on. And the sound soon became loud, continuous jingling, changing its rhythm with the horses' movements, and stopping occasionally and then starting again with a sudden jerk, accompanied by the dull thud of an iron-shod hoof on the ground. Can you imagine this? I can't. Isn't this beautiful writing? Suddenly the door closed and all was silent. The frozen travelers had stopped talking and they stood there stiff and motionless. A curtain of glistening white flakes was falling ceaselessly toward the ground, blurring outlines of the powdering every object with an icy coating. In the deep silence of the town, buried in the winter calm, nothing could be heard but the vague, indefinable, rustling whisper, felt rather than heard, of the falling snow, a mingling of airy particles which seemed to be filling the sky and covering the world. Ladies and gentlemen, have you heard snow falling? I have. You can hear snow falling. I am absolutely amazed at the writing and the translation. The man reappeared with his lantern, pulling along by a rope a miserable and reluctant horse. A miserable and reluctant horse. Come on. He made it stand by the pole, and he fastened the traces, spending a long time adjusting the harness, for he could use only one hand as the other was holding the lantern. You'd think somebody would, help this guy out. Help this guy out. As he was going back to fetch the second horse, he noticed all the travelers standing there motionless, already white with snow. Ladies and gentlemen, they're standing in the snow. In the snow. Pardon me. Why don't you get inside the coach, he said. At least you'd be under cover. This idea apparently had not occurred to them, and they made a rush for the door. The three men installed their wives at the far end and got in themselves. And then the other vague, muffled figures took the remaining places without a word, and their feet sank into the straw which covered the floor. Wow. We're stopping there. So we've got six people we know, man and wife, man and wife, man and wife, and then we have four vague, muffled figures. Vague, unclear. You've been reading with Jimmy. This is part one of 4 parts of Guy de Maupassant's Boule de Suif. Be sure to visit and read other classics on Jimmy, but come back for part 2. We want to find out who these muffled figures are, don't you? And what's going to happen to these people in the coach who are now traveling and they don't have enough sense to get out of the snow. And remember, if you have questions, email me, Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com, Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com. Thanks so much for coming by, and I'll hope to see you soon. Bye-bye. Now, by the way, remember to get out of the snow if it's snowing hard or rain, whatever. Thanks.